Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and discovering that one of the most powerful forces in the universe had simply stopped working. No explosions, no warning, no dramatic countdown, just silence. Because gravity, the invisible force that keeps your feet on the ground, the oceans in their basins, and the moon orbiting Earth, has suddenly switched off. Not forever, just for 5 seconds. 5 seconds doesn't sound like much. You could count it out on your fingers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But gravity has been holding our world together for billions of years. Every object around you, every drop of water in the ocean, every person walking on the street depends on it every moment. Remove it, even briefly, and the planet would experience something close to instant chaos. At the exact moment gravity disappears, nothing on Earth would immediately explode or shatter. Instead, everything would begin to drift. Your body would suddenly feel weightless. The same sensation astronauts experience aboard the International Space Station. If you were standing outside, your feet would lift gently off the ground. If you were sitting in a chair, you and the chair would both float upward together. Coffee would rise out of mugs. Papers would drift across rooms. Cars would slowly lift from the pavement. In homes, kitchens would become slow-motion snow globes. Plates, furniture, food, and dust particles would begin floating in every direction. People would instinctively try to grab onto something. Door frames, railings, countertops. But unless those objects were firmly attached to the earth, they'd float too. Across cities, the streets would transform into bizarre scenes of weightless confusion. Bicycles, trash bins, backpacks, and street signs would rise gently into the air. Construction equipment would lift from work sites. Entire parking lots of cars would slowly begin drifting upward like massive metallic balloons. But while objects near the surface would rise slowly, something far more dramatic would be happening on a much larger scale. The oceans. Right now, gravity is pulling trillions of tons of seawater toward the planet's center. It's the reason oceans hug coastlines and rivers flow downhill. The moment gravity disappears, that enormous mass of water would no longer be anchored to the surface. Instead, the oceans would begin expanding outward, not like a giant wave, but like a massive, slow-motion bubble. Water along coastlines would lift upward, forming enormous floating domes above the planet. Near the surface, waves would dissolve into drifting globes of water suspended in the air. Fish, seaweed, and marine life would suddenly find themselves floating through enormous clouds of seawater. Even the atmosphere would begin to change. Air itself has weight, and gravity keeps it wrapped around the planet like a protective blanket. Without gravity, the atmosphere would begin expanding outward into space. It wouldn't vanish instantly. Earth's magnetic field and inertia would keep much of the atmosphere nearby for those few seconds, but the outer layers would start drifting away. At the same time, airplanes in flight would experience something terrifying. Aircraft rely on gravity and air pressure to maintain stable flight paths. If gravity suddenly disappeared, planes would begin drifting unpredictably. Passengers would float out of their seats, luggage would rise into the air, and pilots would struggle to maintain control. Inside skyscrapers, objects hundreds of meters above ground would begin drifting upward through offices and hallways. People near the tops of buildings might float out of open windows, slowly rising into the sky. For a moment, the entire world would resemble a giant space station. But then comes the real danger, because after 5 seconds, gravity returns. Everything that floated upward would suddenly be pulled back down toward the Earth. Objects that had drifted just a few centimeters off the ground might simply fall harmlessly back into place. But objects that had risen several meters, or even dozens of meters, would slam downward with tremendous force. Cars that lifted into the air would crash back onto roads. Construction equipment would collapse onto work sites. Furniture would rain down inside buildings. People floating near ceilings would be pulled violently toward the floor, and the oceans would return. The massive domes of water that had begun rising into the sky would suddenly collapse back toward the planet's surface. Along coastlines, trillions of tons of seawater would crash back into place almost simultaneously. The result would be enormous waves, not quite the size of asteroid impact tsunamis, but still powerful enough to flood many coastal regions. Ships would slam violently back into the sea. Floating schools of fish would crash downward with the returning water. Airplanes that had drifted upward might suddenly lose altitude, forcing emergency landings around the world. Cities would experience a strange kind of rainfall. Not water droplets, but debris. Objects that had floated high into the air during those 5 seconds would begin falling back to Earth. Tools, bicycles, signs, fragments of buildings, even satellites in very low orbit might experience slight disturbances as gravity reasserts itself. But the damage would depend heavily on how high objects had managed to rise during those 5 seconds. In most places, the event might cause broken windows, collapsed shelves, and localized flooding. But in dense cities, the sudden return of gravity could lead to serious injuries as objects come crashing down. Air travel would likely suffer the most severe consequences. And yet, compared to many cosmic disasters, Earth might actually survive this strange event surprisingly well. 5 seconds is short enough that the planet itself would remain structurally intact. Earth's orbit around the sun would barely change. The moon would continue its slow dance around our planet. Within hours, governments and scientists around the world would begin studying the event, trying to understand what had happened. Satellite networks would analyze atmospheric changes. Oceanographers would study how seawater behaved during the brief moment of weightlessness. Physicists would scramble to explain how one of the four fundamental forces of nature simply vanished, and even briefly. Because gravity is not just some convenient force holding us down. It shapes galaxies. It forms stars. It bends light and warps space-time itself. Without gravity, planets cannot exist. Solar systems cannot form. Even the universe as we know it would collapse into something entirely different. So if gravity truly switched off for 5 seconds, it would not just be a strange accident. It would challenge everything we think we know about the laws of physics. But perhaps the strangest part would come afterward. The moment people realize how fragile our everyday world truly is. Because gravity is always there. Silent, invisible, constant. Holding oceans to the earth. Keeping the air in our lungs. Anchoring our homes, our cities, and our lives to the surface of this planet. We almost never think about it. Until the day it disappears. Even if only for 5 seconds. And when gravity returns, the world would quickly settle back into place. Cars would rest again on pavement. Oceans would calm. The air would stabilize. Life would continue. But humanity would remember that moment forever. The 5 seconds when the entire planet floated. And the invisible force we take for granted revealed just how essential it truly is.